All right. Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining. I'm Heather Mason, the National Bicycle Dealers Association president. The NBDA is thankful to our membership base, the industry, and friends of the industry who have joined us here today. Since 1946, the NBDA has been on a mission to educate and lead retailers to excellence. Advocacy is a large part of our focus, and events like the webinar today help us fulfill our mission. If you're not already a member, please consider joining. The NBDA is a nonprofit and relies heavily on membership. Special thanks to NBDA Association member SGS for leading today's event. E-bike certification to UL 2849, logistics and preparation needed for certification. The goal of this informative webinar is to provide information regarding e-bike certification to UL 2849 and that logistics and preparation needed for brands looking for certification. This in-depth overview will provide you with more knowledge on the process involved and the safety of our products. Some housekeeping before we get started. We're going to save questions to the conclusion of the presentation. Please use the chat function throughout the event to add questions that we will later address following the presentation. I would like to extend a warm welcome to John Ciliege, SGS Vice President. Welcome, John.
Hi, thank you. I'm happy to join this webinar with the NBDA, and my name is John Ciliege. I'm the Vice President of Connectivity for SGS in the U.S. Connectivity is our electrical and electronics division. I've been in the TIC business for over 25 years in various roles. My current role is also not just operations for electrical and electronic products, but also I'm global head of the nationally recognized testing program, which is the OSHA accredited program for SGS. So just a brief contents of what we've covered today. Just a quick overview of SGS, some adoption timelines for e-mobility in the US. We'll talk about UL 2849, the standard for electrical systems for e-bikes, how to prepare for a UL 2849 project, and hurdles that you might encounter during the process of evaluation. So just a brief overview of SGS, founded in 1878, started as an inspections and audit company. Today, we're 98,000 employees, 2,650 laboratories, covering over 7 global industries. We currently have 24 approved NRTL labs globally under our accreditation. So SGS has a comprehensive bicycle and e-bike service, performing safety and performance testing, chemical analysis, testing in the US, Canadian, and EU markets, cover bicycles, so mountain bikes, road bikes, e-bikes, children's bikes, bike accessories such as locks, luggage carriers, child seats. We do the CFR Part 1512, which covers braking systems, mechanical systems, steering systems, and then PPE like gloves, helmets, protective clothing, eye protection, and then of course the e-bike, the 2849. So just with regulations and compliance requirements for e-mobility quickly changing and safety concerns regarding potential fire risks, there's been a quick adoption by numerous in numerous areas within the U.S. So in November 2021, OSHA adopted UL 2849 and UL 2272. So 2272 is the standard for personal e-mobility devices, and 2849 is for the electric e-bikes. They adopted those, and OSHA covers workplace environment. So it was originally for the workplace environment, so delivery, vehicles, transportation at companies and stuff like that, charging at companies. So really geared towards a workplace environment. And then quickly after that, the CPSC called to manufacturers to comply to UL 2849 and 2272. And then September 2023, New York City passed into law that the e-bikes and batteries should be certified by an accredited laboratory to an ISO 17065 laboratory or an NRTL. So OSHA SGS was the first to get OSHA accreditation to UL 2849. We received that in November 2021. We have a comprehensive scope to cover also UL 2271, which is for batteries for light electric vehicle, and 2272 and 2849. And this is what our mark looks like on the product. So we have extensive laboratories globally to cover component certification, battery certification, and the bike certification. Our directory, online directory, can be used to find it could be used by retailers, by buyers, authorities having jurisdiction to see what's approved and what's not approved. As I mentioned earlier, the CPSC issued over 2,000 letters to manufacturers and importers in December of 2022, calling that the manufacturers should comply with UL 2272 and UL 2849 or face possible enforcement action. And then again, in September 2023, New York City adopted their law, which basically requires that e-bikes be certified by an accredited laboratory, and that the certification logo of the company certifying the product appear on the product. The regulation also includes batteries for e-bikes, which have to comply to UL 2271. It also covers e-scooters, similar to UL 2272. And before New York City enacted the law, the only regulation was the UL 2849 for OSHA, through OSHA. Taking a closer look at the standard, UL 2849, it was recently revised and adopted to include as an ANSI standard, and also as by the Standards Council of Canada. So it can be used for US and Canadian markets now. So one thing it's important to realize with 2849 is that it doesn't cover the entire bicycle. It's the electrical system of the e-bike. We'll go through some additional requirements of accessories and other things as well in this presentation. The basic coverage for UL 2849 is a construction evaluation. So we're looking at the components and how they interact and how the bike's constructed. Then we'll do the performance testing, and then we'll do markings and instructions, and that's how the standard is structured. Which there we go. So looking at the components of a bike, we have battery pack, battery charger, cables and connectors. We have the motor and motor controller. And we have the operator interface. And then we'll have enclosures protecting the motor and battery and printed wiring boards within. So we need to look at all these as part of UL 2849. So we'll start with the battery pack. Battery pack shall have a battery management system. We call that a BMS. And that's really what controls and protects the charging and discharging of the battery. Now UL 2849 is quite flexible. You'll see as we go through this presentation on has some flexibility on what standards to use for component approval, but it does require review of the components and approval. For the battery pack, you have 4 options. Option C and D are generally not for are not vehicle specific. So if your battery is certified to those standards, there's some additional testing that's going to be required in UL 2849. The preferred standard for the battery pack is to be certified to UL 2271. And as New York City actually requires that, that's pretty much the option now, is really to go after 2271. On the battery charger, typically we see UL 62368. Sometimes UL 6950, but that standard's kind of being phased out. And you could look also under class 2 or non-class 2 power supplies. But typically we're looking at UL 62368 for the charger. Now you look at the cables and connectors, those all have to be approved as well. So the cable that's used to connect the charger to the e-bike, that's has to be certified UL 62. And then other connectors can be certified to UL 2251, UL 1977, or UL 2238. One of the things is, even if the connectors are approved connectors, they need to be rated for the current and voltage of the application. So you have to make sure that you have the appropriate type of connector, and that also that it's approved. So then we look at the motor. Now motors in hazardous voltage circuit are required to be certified to UL 1004. And if they're in a low voltage circuit, they may or may not be certified to 1004. If they're not certified to 1004, then we would test them to the requirements that are within UL 2849. And a hazardous voltage circuit is defined as a circuit that's greater than 42.4 volts AC or 60 volts DC. Now, the motor controller and the BMS are both considered safety circuits or protective circuits. So a circuit is defined as a protective circuit if it's considered critical to mitigate fire, electric shock, or explosion hazard. And for the motor controller, the protective circuit shall prevent the following. So it should prevent unintentional self-start, electrical motor assistance without pedaling, electrical motor assistance without activation of the startup assistant mode. So the protective circuit plays a significant role in e-bike operation, and to ensure proper function, we'll undergo a risk assessment. And typically we use ISO 12100. We can also do a risk assessment to the other standards listed here, but ISO 12100 is the go-to. That's also the standard that's used in Europe as well. So typically we're looking at that on the risk assessment. And then after the risk assessment, the devices should be evaluated for functionality and reliability. That's functional safety. So on the functional safety, we're using typically ISO 13849, and that's also a standard that they use in Europe as well. And so you have the ISO 12100, which is the methodology for achieving safety, and then you have the 13849, which really goes through the design and integration of the safety. So then we look at the operator interface. So typically the operator interface may have an internal battery, could be touchscreen, have high voltage backlighting associated with it. But the standard for that is typically UL 62368. Again, 6950 is an option. And then we look at enclosure. So an enclosure is going to be something that helps prevent the risk of fire, electric shock, or injury to persons. And so enclosures can be polymeric. If they're a plastic polymeric enclosure, it has to have a minimum rating of V1. And that's per UL 94. But so the enclosure would be minimum of V1. Internal components would be minimum of V2, and an RTI on less than 80 degrees C, and have UV resistance. So we would typically the polymeric material would have been tested for UV resistance, or we can also test that material. Metallic enclosures need to be corrosion resistance, and we'll look to guidance on UL 50E for enclosure testing as well. And then on the ingress protection, that's going to be IP34 minimum. So if the bike is rated at a higher level than IP34, we would test it based on what it's marked, what the manufacturer marks it. But the minimum is 34, and the numbers 3 and 4 mean something. So the first number is protection against solid particles, no greater than 2.5 millimeters. And the second number is protection against splash of water in all directions. And then UL 2849, we also have to look at the electrical spacings. Typically, this applies to printed wiring boards and other components within the battery compartment and the motor controller as well. So we look at the electrical spacings to UL 2849, table 16.1, or 6950 creepage clearance distances, or 62368 creepage clearance distances. So there's some options there. And the printed wiring boards also need to be V1 rated minimum. Performance testing. So we went through the standard construction requirements, component requirements. Now we're looking at the performance testing. Typically, a lot of these tests are standard tests that we would see in almost any product certification, but there are some differences. So input tests, temperature tests, isolation resistance or insulation resistance, dielectric strength, humidity conditioning, abnormal testing, which we'll go through a little bit here, vibration marking testing, strain relief tests, and the key one here for e-bikes is motor assistance control testing. And so next, how do you prepare for UL 2849 project? It's first good to inform your suppliers, invite them to participate with the project. You know, you need to collect up the documents for the components, what their certification is, how they're rated, those kind of things, and arrange test samples. We need a minimum of 1 complete e-bike with charger, typically 3 motor and motor controllers. So the motor controller combination need to be modified so they can be connected directly with an external power supply, not a battery, because we'll run it for a longer time than the battery typically has capacity for. And the motor should be able to spin without being connected to the e-bike. So there's 3 stages. The first stage is a technical meeting with the e-bike manufacturer and suppliers if necessary. This is kind of the process that SGS follows to get through the certification process with our customers. So we'll do the technical meeting, and then after that, we'll do construction evaluation document review. And through the document review, that's component review and construction evaluation. If everything's good, then it makes sense to proceed with the testing. If it's not, then we'll let the manufacturer know and their suppliers, if necessary, what what needs to be done, and then we'll proceed with the testing after that. So just some questions that come up or hurdles that you might encounter. I get a lot of questions about what about existing e-bikes. Generally, an e-bike that's been manufactured without consideration to 2849 is probably not going to pass the testing for UL 2849, given all the component requirements that are necessary for that. And another question is, well, my component supplier doesn't have the necessary approvals. What do I do? We've had cases where you can do testing on the components, but the one problem with that is you don't control the supply chain of that component, so how that product is manufactured. So it can change, and that could affect your product in the future. So it's while we can do the testing, it's generally better off to source approved components, and it'll increase the turnaround time for your testing and get your product certified. So just some other things that come into play when doing testing. There are many destructive tests in UL 2849. Some damage the unit, and this is acceptable as long as it doesn't lead to electric shock or fire hazard. For example, running an overload test or a locked rotor test on the motor. Again, we may damage the product, and that's okay. And then, for the motor controller, we need to be able to operate it without being connected to the e-bike. So additional samples there. We should be able to connect it to an external power supply. And if we have to simulate any of this with the controller, we want to make sure that we don't bypass any of the original safety functions. Other destructive tests include component failure tests, which is common for electrical products. We create a single fault condition on the controller and then turn the power on and see what happens. So it's important that you have a lot of spare parts. And if you can only provide one e-bike, it's going to be a pretty long test duration, and that's hopefully that we don't have failures along the way where again a failure might be okay as long as it doesn't result in an electric shock or fire hazard. It could do what it needs to do as far as the testing is concerned. And this is just a summary of the SGS portfolio for the biking industry. So for North America, we covered the UL 2849, the CFR Part 1512 for the bike itself, mechanical systems, braking systems, so on. And then, there's wireless components, so the FCC, EMC testing there. And then we also can do the European standards. And again, you see the ISO 12100 there. Accessories, so battery chargers, battery packs, motors, functional safety, chemistry testing that may be required, like Prop 65 or REACH, RoHS, and then the requirements for children's bicycles as well. And that leads me to the end of the presentation. Thank you for joining. Hopefully I answered some questions that you might have had. Feel free to reach out to me for any specific questions that might relate to your product. I'm happy to answer those. Also get my technical team here at SGS involved and help work through the process.
Excellent. Thank you, John. I'd like to now take a chance to answer some questions that have been put into our webinar chat. And if anyone on the call listening today has additional questions, please place them in the chat now. Let's start here with a question on battery certification. The question reads, how about battery certification according EN 50604-1? Is it accepted?
It's not for the UL 2849 certification. So you would need to do the UL 2271, and that's actually required. you have to have the list of the standards that I had in the presentation for battery approval. Those are the only options listed in 2849. And given the new law with New York City, they're really regulated UL 2271. So that kind of even limits your options a little bit more. So for U.S. market, U.S. and Canada, you want to go with the UL 2271.
Excellent. Another question that came in since the letter, the CPSC sent the letter notifying manufacturers and brands of the recommendation to UL 2849. Have you seen an increase in brands and suppliers reaching out to you?
Yes, we have, but more as related to the recent law passed. So the law for New York City was written in March, and 6 months later it became law. So we've been getting a lot of inquiries based on that. But yeah, the CPSC has definitely issued the letter, but they haven't specified anything after that. So they say, you know, it might you might be you might have a situation, but you know, for OSHA, you know, if it's workplace environment, it's required to have the NRTL if your e-bike is in a workplace environment, and then a lot of the cities and states are now adopting either ISO 17065 accredited lab or an NRTL lab.
Excellent, thank you. We have more questions coming in. This one reads, I heard that UL has a tendency to accept the test result only from UL test lab. Is that true?
I can't speak for what our competitors may or may not accept. I could say SGS, we accept any certified component that's been certified by an NRTL. So there are 15 NRTLs, I believe, that are accredited by OSHA. So if it's been certified by an NRTL to those standards that are listed in UL 2849, that's acceptable for SGS. But I don't want to speak to what other testing organizations may or may not accept. In some cases, it could be a business decision on their end on what they decide to accept or not, or other reasons. But I don't want to speak for other people. So
thank you for that, John. Another question here. This one we get often from retailers. The question reads, please explain better the difference between compliance to UL 2849 and certification.
That's interesting. Yeah, interesting question. So the like the law for New York City is requiring that e-bikes be certified by an accredited lab, an ISO 17065 lab or an NRTL lab. So in certifying that product to UL 2849, that product is now in compliance with the standard. So I think it depends on, you know, the wording is if the requirement is that this product must comply with this standard, then, you know, you have to dig a little bit deeper to see, like for example, if it's workplace environment, it's mandatory that it be an RTL. And individual cities and states are saying NRTL or 17065. The CPSC says it needs to be compliant to UL 2849. So I would generally lean towards a ISO 17065 or an RTL accredited lab to do that. But I can see some of the gray area in that question there. For me, and being in the testing, inspection, certification business, you have to show proof of compliance. So, you know, unless you can, you can do all those testing and show proof. In Europe, it's a little bit different. If you like, if you have a product that's CE marked, you don't necessarily have to go to a third party, as long as you can show compliance. But in the US, it really relates to if you're compliant, then you're certified by a test laboratory.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, so this next question says, can you do CE e-bike testing in the USA? So the CE marking for e-bikes and e-mountain bikes, I guess, is the question?
Yeah, that's that was the requirements on the last slide that I had was for the European market. Yes.
Okay, one more question here that's come in. Does SGS offer risk assessments or any other service that could review bikes and test reports? So even though all UL standards are met, we would like to have an organization identify any shortfalls in bike design or warnings. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, definitely. You know, risk assessment is also done as part of the UL 2849 evaluation. That's the ISO 12100 standard that I mentioned. That's the risk assessment. You know, we do review and review that as well, and to ensure compliance. If that's necessary, if you come to SGS for certification, we're gonna review that as part of the requirements. So.
Okay. Question here. How long does the UL 2849 testing take? And then a question about the associated costs. And I know they're probably varied depending on the amount of the brand, but I'll let you answer it, John. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, you know, that question comes up often, but the time and the cost really depend on the preparation. So as we go through the steps, you know, step one, we do the document review and meet with our client, and also if the client so chooses, we'll meet with the suppliers for them as well to ensure that the components are certified and approved. And if that's the case, the timing is much quicker. Also, you know, as part of a e-bike, we can do the certification of the battery pack to UL 2271. And if you already have an approved battery pack, that reduces cost for testing significantly, and also timing, because the battery testing, the charge and discharge cycling of that for 2271 takes some time. So it depends on the case. So I'd say reach out to me. Let's see what you have, and then we can review timing and pricing depending on that. If you're having to look at, we can let's say you make your own motor controller or something, we can review that to UL 62368. But that adds time and cost to the project, rather you provide one that's already approved. So everything is, we need to look at how the product's made, and that's why I wanted to take the time to do this webinar, because I think if you look at it at the beginning and look at how you source the components, it makes the process pretty easy. The standard's pretty straightforward in the fact that, if you source the right components, you can move through it pretty quickly.
I like that. So it's on a project by project basis. And thank you for your time today, John. The questions are still coming in, and there's some great questions. So if you don't mind, I'm going to keep rolling through these. Does meeting UL 2849 mean that the battery by definition meets UL 2271?
Yes, I guess it does, because we have to do the 2271 testing in order to move on. But I also maybe not, because 2849 gives you 4 options for your battery pack, right? We went through those 4 standards. 2 of the standards are non-vehicle based standards, so then it requires that we do additional testing to go 2849. So I guess the answer is yes and no, because we can do the testing is prescribed in 2849, but in states like New York, where they're requiring the 2271 on the battery, then we have to make sure that that battery is to 2271. So so yes, It doesn't necessarily mean if we have a bike that's certified to UL 2849 that the battery is certified to 2271, because the standard does allow us to do testing to the other standards outside of 2271.
Excellent. This question is asking specifically where SGS performs tests. Are they done in the US and Europe and China?
Yes, we have a laboratory here in my home base in Swanee, Georgia. We have full capabilities in Taiwan, in Shenzhen, and in Germany.
Excellent. The question here is asking around satisfying the new New York City law. Is complete bicycle UL testing required for e-bikes that use e-system parts that are UL compliant individually?
Can you repeat that question?
Is complete bicycle UL testing required? So I think they're asking, do they need to test to UL 2849, or if they have an e-system or an e-bike with parts that are UL compliant individually, is that enough?
Well, that's why I talked a little bit about so if the bike is used in a workplace environment, it's regulated by OSHA that it needs to be UL 2849 certified. So that means the bike needs to have the label on it, the testing laboratory label. So it would need to be certified UL 2849. New York City is also requiring certification of the bike to 2849. The CPSC is also saying that the bike should be tested to UL 2849. So having a bike with approved components doesn't necessarily mean you have a bike that's approved to UL 2849. Hopefully I answered that question correct. But whoever asked that question, feel free to reach out to me direct, and we can talk a little bit or explore a little bit more about that.
Excellent, excellent. And I have about 6 more questions, so we'll keep rolling here. This one says, as part of the testing and certification, does SGS inspect the system component manufacturer's plants? So as part of that testing, is that additional inspection of the plants done?
No. So if our certification is with the manufacturer of the bike, and ISO 17065 certification or NRTL certification requires factory audits of the plant, and we will factory audit the plants. That's why the regulation is saying 17065 or NRTL, because those two accreditations require factory audits, and so we do audit the factory for the bike manufacturer. Now, the components, they're also, that's why the components are required to be certified. And on that case, whoever certifies the components, and in SGS or another NRTL, they would audit the factory as part of that certification for that component, whether it's a 62368 certification or a UL 2271 certification. That would be audited by the component approval. If we do the testing in our lab and use that component within the product, we would then evaluate that product, that component on an annual basis within SGS, to ensure that the product or the component is the same as it was when we originally tested it. So it'd be considered an unapproved component in which we did the testing to ensure compliance, and we would review that component on an annual basis. If it's a approved component, then it gets the factory audits already. So we would not audit the component manufacturers because they already have certification. But for example, if we do an enclosure test or something that's not, or a polymeric test for UV resistance, and as part of UL 2849, we would just follow up with that component on an annual basis to make sure that it's the same component that we tested originally. So we detail out the construction and the certification report, and then we look at it in the lab. So that hopefully answers the question, but really the requirements of the components meeting specific component requirement standards already has built in that they're being factory audited. So for example, we talked about motor that's certified to UL 1004. That motor is a motor manufacturer. They make motors, so they probably have other certifications for other types of applications, and they might use an NRTL to do that certification. That NRTL would audit the factory to ensure that their motors are being manufactured the same way, just as we would with the bike, and they would do that separately. So,
Excellent. Thank you for that clarification there. This question is on when we're dealing with multiple models of bikes. So often we'll have a manufacturer who uses the same battery motor, but then other components. So let's say there's 10 different models of bikes. Would you be able to just test one of those bikes that use the same battery but different components to certify all of that model? Or would you need to test each specific bike with its specific components?
we'll look the components. So like the operator display and stuff like that could be alternate choices that are still certified to the appropriate standard, which in most cases is 62368. But for us, the battery pack and the motor controller, those are kind of integrated, work together type devices. So for example, the battery pack UL 2271, if you have alternate battery packs that are certified UL 2271, that's okay. And the motor controller itself, we need to look at that. And because remember, we have to do the 12100 risk assessment and the functionality to UL 13849. So it depends on the component, but we usually list alternate components. Because supply chains change a lot. So we try to incorporate alternate components if the manufacturer has that into our certification if possible. But yeah, there are options for alternate components. Supply chains change, and we often, somebody may need a different display or something like that. So we can't do that, or a different battery pack. That's if it's an approved component, it makes it a lot easier. On the motor controller itself, we typically have to look at that with regards to UL 2849. So typically there's not a lot of changes in that specific application. We look at it each on a case-by-case basis.
Excellent. And then there's like a kind of a follow-up question then. It says, after certification, can individual components be swapped without a complete recertification? It sounds like there's a list of acceptable, but again, it might be a case by case then.
Yeah, so our certification report basically lists the components that are part of the product. So it'll list the manufacturer, the ratings, the part number, and stuff like that. So we would list alternates in there. If you want to change components, we would list alternates during the certification process. If afterwards something changes, it depends on what the component is, what some testing, maybe limited testing, we need to do to include that as an alternate into the certification. But the manufacturer can't freely change the components because that might change the results of the testing. So we list out, every certification report has the critical components listed. And when we do the factory audit, the inspector is looking to make sure that product is the same product that we tested.
Question here, we're talking about UL certification, UL 2849. Where does EN 15194 fit in, and is that acceptable in the US at this point?
We need to go back to the standards that are called out in 2849. Those are the standards that we need to look at. during the certification process. So we can do a gap analysis if necessary, if it's not, if it's for Europe and we're trying to do certification in the US.
Okay. We've heard that UL is receiving pushback from e-bike manufacturers that the 2849 requirements are too strict. Is there any truth to this? And do you foresee the 2849 requirements getting any easement on them, if you would?
I think in some cases, sourcing components might not meet the certification requirements for those components. But the risks, fire risks, we see them every day in the news, things going on like that. So there's a reason why, and when we do the UL 2271, it's pretty extensive testing, and then on the motor controller we're simulating actual faults that can happen, and doing the risk assessment, and the functional safety is a big important part of that. So I don't see that the way the standard is written is use certified components, and then the product certification goes easier. It could be that we can test those components again, but a lot of times the manufacturer doesn't have control over the supply chain and those components, and that becomes the difficult factor is components like connectors and stuff don't always have the proper UL certification. We can do that testing within the lab. It's basically endurance testing, and look at the material that the plastic connector is made from. So we can do things like that to help the manufacturer if they can't find a certified component. But yeah, I don't see a lot of relief on the battery, because that's the big critical part, and the functional safety part for the motor controller.
Excellent. A couple more questions here. Just to note, one of our attendees mentioned that the New York City ordinance, the wording was changed to recognize ISO 17025 certified labs to perform testing. Anything that anything that we should take into consideration there? Anything that you would want to say on that?
Yeah, I attended the New York City public hearing late last year, and I think it was actually at the same time the Shift conference happened during that same time frame. I attended online, but the wording is interesting. If you read it from a standard perspective, it says it's actually worded that currently, and I just read it 2 days ago, and it's worded that it should be an ISO 17025 accredited lab, and ISO 17065, and then there's the or NRTL. So I don't read it as ISO 17025 or 17065 or NRTL. So I think there's a little bit of clarification still that may need to be done with New York City, because ISO 17025 is the lab has competence to do the testing. They're accredited by A2LA, NavLab, IAS, or something like that, but it doesn't have the factory audits, and I think that's the key. So when I read the wording, it said ISO 17025 and ISO 17065 or NRTL. I believe that's close to what the wording said, but it did. I know it didn't read, and we read standards all the time, so we look at words like shall or should. Should it or shall? Shall means it has to. Should means it's a recommendation. And in this case, it doesn't say 17025 or 17065, and so I don't think there's an option there. But I think it reads 17025 and 17065. But we can look at that again. I know that there's been a lot of questions about that, actually. So and I think maybe some more clarification has come out recently. But I think the last thing that I've seen was some.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I know that that's a continuing conversation that New York City is refining that language. I know that San Francisco is considering passing some similar, requirements. Are there any other states or cities that are requiring testing or anything that you know of? I just have a couple on my radar, but nothing like New York City has done.
Yeah, I mean, California, I'm surprised California wasn't first, right? But I think New York City has the greatest population of e-bikes used for delivery and stuff like that. And so I think it's become a huge problem for them. But yeah, California definitely is next. And I would assume that some of the other Western states there are going to follow suit pretty quickly.
Feel as an industry, so we have two questions on labeling requirements and documentation. And I feel like that is an area that we've been struggling to get like a complete list or some sort of way to determine what brands have what certifications. Are there any labeling requirements for e-bikes or any documentation that is required following certification at this point?
Well, the requirement is that the accredited testing laboratories have to be marked on the product. So who's ever tested and certified it, it has to be visible on the product. And I think that answered your question. But other markings like what class of device it is, or what the input ratings are for charging and stuff like that. Those are markings that we go through as part of the UL 2849 investigation. So there's that's the third stage of the UL 2849 evaluation. So we'll review the markings to make sure they comply with the standard. And we also include those markings in the certification report. So that their follow-up service, when we do the factory audits, they'll know exactly what markings to look for as well, and they're clearly spelled out in 2849. But going to again, like New York City and stuff, they're require the logo and certification on the product, so that a consumer can see, yes, this product has been tested to 2849 and meets the requirements. And I think that's the important part.
Excellent. So I have two questions left, and one continues to follow on that consumer-facing material. Is there any bike warning labels or anything that the testing labs need to or that UL asks that we have on the bikes that have been tested, or any certain labels other than just the testing labs logo?
Yeah. I mean, there's a number of markings that are required, like the charger, the input ratings of it. So we do go through the list of markings. Those are identified in 2849.
Okay, so the last question I have here, and thank you, John. You've been a great guest answering all these questions. This one reads, to your experience, what are the chances to get the positive testing results for UL 2849 without close cooperation from supplier of electrical systems? Interesting question. So maybe if you're not using maybe a major brand or a major component supplier, I think that's the way the question reads. I think this.
Yes, I mean, again, we can test. We could test the battery to UL 2271, certify the battery. We can test, display modules, connectors to UL 62. It adds a lot of cost. And they're not just that though, but there's no control over, that connector manufacturer can change their source of supply for the polymeric material, and the end user doesn't have any control over that. So there would need to be at least some, agreement with the manufacturer who's sourcing that component, saying, hey, you don't have a certified component. I'm gonna get it tested by a laboratory and it needs to stay the same. And in that case, we can do the testing, and we'll include the details of that component within our certification report, and we'll review that component annually to make sure that it's the same component. But it does add time, significant time and cost, and there's some hesitation because the bike manufacturer doesn't have control over or auditing practices necessarily to make sure that that connector is the same connector that SGS tested, for example. And then, then it could create problems where if it's not, then you got recall and stuff like that that could take place.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the engagement from our audience, for all the questions that came in. Lots of fabulous questions, and I really appreciate, John, your willingness to present this information to us and walk us through this. To all of our attendees, thank you for joining. Recording of this presentation will be on the NBDA YouTube channel in the coming day. We'd love to see you again. The NBDA website has a complete list of our upcoming events and webinars. We appreciate your attendance and hope you can join us. John, very much appreciate your time here and the team at SGS for making this possible.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. I enjoy working with the NBDA, so thank you.
Excellent. To all our attendees, thank you and have a great afternoon.